Hello and welcome to the Refugee Welcome Collective Lunch and Learn series. In these sessions, we aim to bring interesting and timely information to you, supporters of refugees. Whether you are a volunteer, community sponsor, resettlement agency staff, a local advocate, or just someone who is interested in learning more, we hope you enjoy today's session, Identifying and Sharing Untold Refugee Stories. This is the second session in a series exploring the value of storytelling in welcoming communities. So if you did not see it, I would encourage you to view the Lunch and Learn, the stories we tell and why they matter in our resource library. Here at the Refugee Welcome Collective, we collaborate with partners to provide in-depth training programs, weekly learning sessions, resources, and on-demand technical assistance for sponsors, practitioners at resettlement agencies, refugees paired with sponsors, community and institutional partners, and others to support quality community sponsorship programs across the United States. As a reminder for everyone joining the Lunch and Learn today, there is a control panel in the upper right-hand corner of your screen that will allow you to submit questions through the questions box. There will be ample time at the end of the webinar for questions and answers. Everyone on today's webinar is automatically muted. However, if you have any tech issues, please raise your hand through the control panel or submit a question in the questions box so that we can assist you. Additionally, a recording and helpful links will be sent to everyone at the end of today's webinar. This brings us to our presenters for today. Our presenters are BR Khan. BR was born in Sudan and spent 20 years of his life in a refugee camp in Kenya, resettling in the United States in 2015. He recently graduated from the University of Massachusetts Lowell with a degree in international business and marketing. He served as an interpreter at the International Institute of New England, the local refugee resettlement agency. BR is an experienced storyteller and has performed for years with Suitcase Stories, a program of the International Institute of New England. We also have with us today Cheryl Hamilton. Cheryl has devoted her career to advancing more inclusive communities and storytelling. She is the founder and director of Stellar Story Company, which helps people and institutions deliver extraordinary stories and unforgettable events that lead to meaningful change. Previously, she directed programs for local, national, and international refugee organizations. She is also the curator and coach for the national television show, Stories from the Stage, featured on PBS and World Channel. Cheryl and BR, thank you so much for joining us today.
Oh my gosh, thanks for having us back. It's so wonderful. And I love that I get to spend another 45 minutes with my friend BR. BR, thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
BR, we just heard the facts of your background. I wonder if you could just say a few words about your storytelling experiences. How did you get started? And what are the different types of places that you have told some stories?
Well, I started back in 2016 when Trump put a ban on immigrations and separating families from reuniting. Cheryl actually approached me when I used to be interpreter at International Institute of New England. And that's when she talked to me about what are the benefits of actually telling stories. And I became intrigued, and that's actually how I started.
And can you tell the different, I can share, but if you want to share a couple of the places that you've told your stories, because it's pretty impressive.
Yeah, I share my stories in a few different places. I did schools, the library, equally I did at different events, and also even like during the International Institute, as they call the, what's the word, where they actually acknowledge the immigrants who make impact in the community. Yeah, so different places.
So my friend BR here is being incredibly humble. When I asked him if he would tell his story or some of his stories, which we're going to unpack together today, the first time was in front of 350 people at a major venue in downtown Boston. Then he has gone on and performed at several schools. And it's actually one of the places I love having BR join me, because when he walks in, the students like lean in and they're curious about like, who is this individual? What has he accomplished? You know, by his background. In many cases, they're meeting someone from Sudan that they have never met before. And then most recently, he's especially humble. We just taped his story, one of his stories, for Stories from the Stage, our national media program, which we produce with World Channel and streams on PBS and other locations. So BR, we're going to unpack and talk about the stories you chose to tell in a little bit, but I'm going to give a little more background to those of you that are joining And again, thanks for having us. We love being any chance to talk about stories. Thanks to those of you that watched the last session, and we hope you continue to join us. Again, a little briefly about Stellar Story Company. This is a business I launched. We have an international team of people representing 7 nationalities. And our whole goal is to help people make meaningful change like BR has through the power of storytelling. Grace, perhaps you can advance the next slide. Some of the ways we do that, particularly with refugee and nonprofit organizations or community groups, is we do some training about how do we craft stories well, whether that's for fundraising or for advocacy, or frankly, just for your own personal library of stories. We put on storytelling events like VR just described, where refugees and immigrants stand on stage, and allies, which we're going to talk to about, telling meaningful stories. We do some individual coaching. So a lot of times people bring us in to help newly arrived refugees or long-term residents figure out, like, what story should I tell? And that's what we're going to be talking a lot about today. And then finally, we do create media opportunities. So if you're somebody out there that's like, I would like my story to be told or heard by many people, please reach out to us. We like to create opportunities for people to connect. But today we're really going to be talking about why should I have a story library to begin with, and how do we improve that library of stories? So here are some of the reasons I just want to cover in my own experience. So my background as it relates to storytelling was I have worked in the refugee field for 20 years as communications directors, as development directors, as community outreach workers. But my real story begins back in 2001 when 5,000 Somali refugees moved into my hometown of Lewiston, Maine. And as I often say to people, many people wrote about our experience. Lots of journalists, there was documentaries made about our town, there were books written. There's an incredible book called One Goal, which chronicles the stories of the high school soccer team winning the state championship for the first time in 40 years, which happened to be a team made up of former refugees, immigrant children, and neighbors that, you know, I grew up with. But what always frustrated me is that a lot of the pieces that were written early on about our town were written by people who weren't from the town, people coming in and covering our story. And I felt that although some of them were excellent, other ones misrepresented our actual experience. So in 2008, a director of theater in Baltimore, Maryland suggested that I write a one-woman show about my storytelling, about my experience in Maine through first-person stories. Now, I thought he was kind of crazy at the time. I was a policy person. I was a service provider. I didn't know anything about storytelling. But through his support, he helped me think about why our stories matter, why should we tell them, and how do we tell them well so that they connect with other people. Well, I got hooked. And I got hooked not only in sharing my own stories about this interesting field that we all work in, but also making sure that immigrants and refugees and others had a platform for theirs. Here's the general things, and I'm going to do a lot of talking up front. Then we're going to get back to BR's story, I should say that. But one thing that's interesting, particularly in our refugee network, is we tend to keep telling the same story over and over again. And what I mean by that is oftentimes the chronology, and I know BR and I had this conversation. When you ask someone who's a refugee to share their story, it's like, I was born here, and let me tell you all the important dates that happened until I met you in my life. Now, those dates are critical, except it's actually not the thing that people connect with most. You're going to be looking for the universal themes. It's also a very hard story to tell. That's too much information. And you're actually giving away so many wonderful stories by trying to condense it all. So as BR, for example, when we first met, I was like, he told me 20 years in a refugee camp. And I thought, whew, that's a one-man show. And we were like, well, what's one singular day you'll never forget in that experience? Or what is one interaction you had in the camp that was meaningful to you? And he's going to, in a moment, share an example of one of those stories. Which comes to me, the stories we tell are too big. Sometimes we say, I want to tell a story about refugee employment. And again, we try to tell the whole story rather than one meaningful employee or one meaningful employer, or one job that you didn't expect to secure, but actually changed your life. So again, we want to be looking at narrowing the stories we're telling. We also tend to tell anecdotes and not stories. Now, if you're wondering what the difference is, an anecdote is just something interesting that happened. But what's important in a story is there has to be some sort of meaningful change. It has something deeper in the story that will resonate with your listeners. You also want to identify the meaningful, relatable moments. And that might seem strange when we talk about refugees. If you're talking to a non-refugee, someone born in this country, perhaps who hasn't had a chance to travel, is new to the subject of refugee resettlement, there's a tendency to want to explain the most outstanding moments, or like, again, everything that happened in a refugee camp or the unfortunate violent circumstances that someone fled. But to someone that we're trying to enter and open the conversation of refugee resettlement to, that can feel so removed from the individual that, although educational, again, doesn't necessarily achieve our goal, which is to connect people. So what we're going to talk about is, how do I find those relatable moments, even if my life has been as different as possible as somebody who perhaps came to this country as a refugee. We also sometimes focus disproportionately on specific stages of the refugee journey. I find that very often we hear about the day that people fled, which of course is a life-altering situation for the refugee individual, but it's not necessarily, again, there's other moments that are transformative in someone's life. And so encouraging people to look at those moments also, so that we educate people to the broader impact. I mean, we know that the average time that someone spends as a refugee is 18 years. So if we're only focusing on the day people fled or the day that they arrived in the United States, we're overlooking so many important moments that would be incredible stories for people to understand. Helping people understand, so what does life look like when you're displaced for 18 years? Like, how are people surviving? How are people contributing to the communities where they are? What kind of relationships have people made? One of my favorite suitcase story moments was when I was interviewing a gentleman from the Congo, and he ended up telling his story actually on the TV show and with VR and Suitcase Stories. And he said, you know, what's interesting is, I said, is there anything you carried in your journey that was meaningful to you? And he pulled out a journal. Now I was like, how wonderful. We've got a whole collection of stories to look through in this journal. And he said, no, no, no. I want to show this to you because on the last page, I had everybody who made a life impact in my life, an impact in my life, to sign my journal in the refugee journey. So he has 22 stories of people that changed his life in some way, or he changed theirs. And the last thing I want to say that we sometimes need to add to our refugee toolkit of stories is stories of those interactions between US and foreign-born residents, right? These really meaningful moments, these intercultural moments. And I say that as somebody who's as excited as you are to invite people into this world that we all work in and create a welcoming community. But sometimes just saying befriend someone who's a refugee or help someone who's a refugee, people don't know where to start, or they don't know exactly what we mean. And if we tell stories that model the behavior change that we want from people, then you start to see the power of storytelling. So those are some of the reasons that I hope all of you think, like, I may have 1 or 2 stories right now. You should have 6, 7, 8. I mean, my one-person play has 18 stories packed into 90 minutes, and BR has already started building. You've told 3 different style of stories, and we'll get to those in a second. Next slide. The other thing I want to say briefly is another reason on a very deep level we need to focus on the type of stories we tell is that sometimes intentionally or otherwise, we perpetuate stereotypes that we should be countering. And this is why I got into the refugee storytelling to begin with, is to counter some of the narratives during the last election and the impact afterwards. For me, my frustration was when I was getting into the field in the 90s and early 2000s with the resettlement of the Lost Boys. Almost every movie and every book we saw really focused on this moment of teaching Lost Boys how to use toilets in the United States. And it really bothered me because I thought, that's just an anecdote. But more importantly, we know all kinds of things that are layered, as if someone who has survived, walked across a country, made it possible to come to this country, we should be focusing on the skills and talents and contributions they've made rather than over focusing on these moments of like learning. I also think it's kind of funny because if you've traveled to Africa, you know that you've gone through at least 2 airports before you come to the United States, which means you've probably used a bathroom, which means I just feel like, again, these stories are not nearly as interesting as the type of stories that we could be telling. For example, next slide. When we started Suitcase Stories, I started interviewing people from Africa about their stories. And I said, which stories do you want to tell? And very quickly, let me give you 3 incredible examples. Rahima is also from Lowell, Massachusetts, which is where BR lives and works, and he actually went to school with her. She did not want to talk about her experiences prior to come to the United States. It was too emotional and fraught with trauma for her. So I said, well, what story would you like to tell? And she told an incredible story about joining the track and field team in Lowell as a way to make friendships in this country, and some of the struggles she had with that, but also the incredible moments of memory for her when she actually did make those relationships. Secondly, you may recognize Rebecca Deng. She's an incredible South Sudanese refugee. She was one of the 82 lost girls, a story we did not hear enough about in the United States. She tells stories about her journey to this country and what it was like to resettle compared to the experiences of the 3,500 lost boys who were resettled. Finally, the first person who ever performed in Suitcase Stories for me was meaningful because I began my career working with Somali refugees. And I was, like BR, our interpreter, Suleika, was also Somali. And I asked her what story she should tell. And she's like, well, I'll tell my refugee journey. And again, I was like, too big. How do we narrow? And I said, is there something you think that people don't know about your experience or don't understand about the power and impact of women in refugee journeys? And I said, what's a memory from your time in the camp? And she said, well, I did deliver, I think, over 150 babies because there weren't enough healthcare providers in the camps that they trained us how to deliver this many children. That is what led her to work as a CNA in this country and want to get her nursing degree. She also said, and maybe it's interesting that I also got elected to represent the more than 6,000 Somali refugees that fled with us in the Refugee Camp Council. And I thought, what a strength-based, incredible story that we don't hear enough about. Which I'm now going to ask BR. BR, I'm going to come back to that slide. I'm going to let BR go in the interest of time because I'm saying, I want to make sure I'm going too much. But BR, when you and I first met, we had the same conversation. I was like, listen, tell me your story. Can you share the story that you first told? I know you've told several. Can you give us a flavor of that story because it related to a particular time in the camp that you would never forget?
Yeah. So I remember I was 13 and I woke up just like a normal day. It was a beautiful sunny day, and do what I normally do in the morning, taking a shower, brushing my teeth, then joining my family on a dining table to have breakfast. And at that moment, we start talking about different experience. My mom started telling us stories about how we left Sudan to Kenya and all that experience, the traumatic experience. And then I went to school. But in the refugee camp, there is different ethnicity. There are Somalis, there are Congolese, there are Sudanese, people from different countries. But when we live in the camp, we all know each other like that is our country. That's where we come from, the camp, because we don't know any life outside of that environment. But then when I started going to school, I met different teachers, different students, and I started interacting, and I became part of the drama team, the poem teams. And that's when one of my teachers wrote this incredible poem. And the poem title was, I am an African child, and I've suffered for so long. How long should I continue suffering? At that moment, I did not understand the word suffering because I couldn't relate to it. So that's when I started asking my teacher, what does he mean by that word? And he started explaining to me that all of us come from different backgrounds, different countries, but we're here for one specific reason because we are all refugees. At that point, I did not understand the term refugee. And I started asking him, what do you mean by a refugee? And he started telling me a refugee is somebody who left his country because of a civil war and who actually flee for safety reason. That's when I started going home, asking my mom, and my friends started asking their parents, and we started collecting different stories, and we came to realize that irrespective of where we came from, we all share something in common, and that's our refugee status. That's just a little bit of it. It's a long story. We can actually put it into very few minutes. So that's just the summary of it.
And we're going to make sure to share the link of the 9-minute version that you tell so beautifully on stage. BR, I remember talking to you about this and I was like, wait, you didn't know you were a refugee, and you reminded me so eloquently that, of course, we don't, when you're in the context your whole life and you don't know anything different, for you, that is the normal. And I thought that was really beautiful. The reason I also love this story is BR takes this into schools, and he talks about what school is like for him. And so students become curious about, yeah, how does one get education in a camp? What kind of things are they studying? And BR, you always end your story saying two things. One is about the value of education, which I know the principals and teachers really appreciate you reinforcing for students in this country. But also, can you tell us why you decided to tell your story? It was really important for you.
I decided to tell my story because I felt like there's millions of children around the world that don't have a voice. And I could be the voice for those kids because I see myself in them, especially the kids in the refugee camps in different countries, in Syria, in Sudan, in Ethiopia, in Kenya. And that is when I wanted to be the representation of them because I have lived that life and I have experienced it. And I wanted to be the voice for them because they don't have the voice. They don't have the platform to tell their stories.
Now, we and I talked about how storytelling at its core is still a craft. It's still a skill that people can learn because you always want to tell the best version of your story. What have you learned that's important when you craft your story?
That's the techniques. There's different technique to storytelling and also understanding the theme, also understanding your audience, analyzing them, and then making sure that you pick a story that they can relate to.
Mm-hmm. Even if their lives haven't been 20 years in a refugee camp. Can
Absolutely.
you now, we also know that knowing your audience is important and thinking about the kind of story that's going to resonate with someone. So you have more than one because maybe that story isn't the story an employer necessarily needs to hear, or maybe you have a specific donor or someone that's a community member that wants to understand. Can you describe, without, you don't need to tell the whole story, but describe the two other stories that you've told?
The other story was an experience when my mom went into labor in a refugee camp during the flood. I think a lot of people who follow the media might have heard of 2006 flood in the Dadaab refugee camp, which displaced a lot of people. And that's when my mom went into labor. That was another story. The other story is something that happened when I was in Kenya. And when I came to the United States, I encountered the same thing about the homeless population. And it's something that actually surprised me the most because when you are outside the United States, you would never think that you will find homeless people in the US because US is a developed country and it's a first world country and everybody think as US as heaven when you're not in the United States. So coming to the US, experiencing a homeless person took me back to when a woman mistake me as a homeless person and she came into my rescue thinking that I was a homeless person. Little did she know that I wasn't homeless. So when I encountered that here, I felt like a lot of people could relate to that story.
No, it's really important about the value of individuals. So BR has chosen different times to share those stories. Now we can advance to the next slide. Now, when I talk about the untold stories of refugees, sometimes that doesn't need to be someone who is a refugee, like myself. We have valuable stories. I say that refugee resettlement is one of the most interesting professions professionally to work in because it touches on every area of life from living standards to love. So when we start growing our spokesperson for our refugee community, we actually reached out to individuals who are not refugees, but whose lives have been impacted because migration affects all of us. We also wanted to challenge people's ideas of who a refugee is because, for example, the woman on the left here, her name is Renaj, she's from Syria. She started telling stories with our refugee program because people assume that she's a refugee just because she's from Syria. And she wanted to talk about what that was like for her, empathetic to the plight of her fellow Syrians, but also she herself was saying, I came here for education. I came here for a different reason. But my children often get called refugees, and that can be challenging for them to navigate. We also had an incredible story told by a Polish poet, Ava. Ava just told a hilarious and then very meaningful story about coming through the airport. It's a funny story. People, when you think refugee, doesn't necessarily think funny, that someone confiscates her Polish sausage that is so important to her. And so she can't get it through TSA. But because of that experience, she realizes that what a privilege it is to even be able to bring an item to this country. So she ended up going to Ellis Island and starting researching the items that refugees bring to this country and wrote a whole anthology of poems dedicated to the experiences of refugees and immigrants. And finally, perhaps surprisingly, some people are like, we should only save refugees told by, again, someone who came to this country. But when we found out that when we started going out to donors, it was very helpful for them to see themselves and understand the actual work. So Kevin, who happens to be a US born white man, former military, told a story about his work as a case manager and what he learned. But what's really terrific about his story that I love, and we'll send you that link as well, is that the transformation for him was challenging his own stereotypes. He just had to place 4 refugees in housing, but they happened to be from 4 countries, 4 different ages, 4 different religions, 4 different languages. He was like, this is going to go badly. But in fact, it went beautifully, and he learned a lot about the work, and it's an incredible story of challenging your ideas of data versus people. So that can give you some of those senses of stories. In a few minutes, we're going to open up to questions because we'd love to hear, how we can help you unpack your stories. But here are a few suggestions of ways to start. On our next slide. The first thing is, honestly, we say in storytelling, in all worlds of storytelling, that one good story calls another. I'm sure that as you've listened to BR, or I've given you a few samples of these other stories, there might be like little light bulbs going off in your head that are like, oh yeah, I have a story of maybe a specific time that I met someone in this through this network, or an unexpected moment of culture shock. BR told that story about homelessness when I asked him to tell a story about culture shock. Now, we have certainly heard many anecdotal stories about discovering snow for the first time for people from Africa, or perhaps a language barrier. But he wanted to offer an additional type of story that we don't hear enough about, which is even our own stereotypes of this, or people's stereotypes of what life is like in the United States. The second thing we've talked about, again, is being very specific, taking a big chunk of time and narrowing it down. Almost all the refugee stories I tell are stories that were involved less than an hour of my life. I tell a story about the first day on the job as a cultural skills specialist and worrying that I am going to do everything wrong. I'm so nervous that I'm not going to be doing a good job. And my job, I thought, was just to educate people about US culture, which you can imagine is fraught because even defining US culture is difficult. But instead, my first client was a gentleman who had actually needed a prosthetic leg because he had lost his leg in another country during the war. And I was like, I don't know if I know how to do that. It was the first hour of my job. Now, fortunately, my colleague helped me. We found the gentleman a leg, but it was a reminder that refugee resettlement is going to be different work, and that I'm going to have to be creative and collaborative and learn from others. Another story I happen to tell is about when I finally did go to Nairobi, because I wanted to see the circumstances that refugees lived through before they came to the United States to be a better cultural skills specialist. But while in Nairobi, while at the IOM Departure Center, helping a young Ethiopian boy resettle to Seattle, I walked in, and BR, I'm sure you remember your suitcase, but there's bags that line up. And if you've been at IOM, you know they put a big piece of masking tape with the person's case number and their destination. Well, folks, 4 suitcases back was a suitcase that said Lewiston, Maine, my hometown. And I freak out, and I'm yelling, and I'm asking whose bag is it? And everyone's like, oh my God. Long story short, I find the owner of the bag. It's a woman with 3 children. This story couldn't teach us more about how small the world is. It was the wife of my first colleague in Lewiston who had been separated from his wife and children for a decade. And so she was going to finally reunite in our hometown. Like, those are stories that we can be looking for. The third thing is to identify stories the stories that people wish were told more or told differently. Kind of like our example of the toilet story. What other story can we highlight about the experiences and talents of refugees? The best way to find this, ask a refugee. Ask what stories that they think are not being told in the media. This is how we were able to find so many incredible stories in our refugee community in Massachusetts and New Hampshire. Finally, BR mentioned this, focusing on the universal theme. If you remember nothing else from today, I want you to remember these 2 questions. If you're wondering if you have a story, first of all, you need to say, what are the action in the story? What actually happens? Like, where am I? What are the scenes? What's the conflict? What's happening? We're going to talk about this more in our third webinar on January 9th, but like, what's actually happening? Because if there's no action and there's no scene, you actually have a speech. So that's important. But the next question in your storytelling is, what makes this story meaningful to you and meaningful to others? Because otherwise, again, you just have an anecdote, an interesting random thing that happened. Now, interestingly, often your anecdote is a story, but you just haven't spent enough time thinking, why am I remembering this? Like, why has this stayed with me for 5, 10, 15 years? And then finally, I just want to say a brief suggestion also. For those of us in refugee resettlement, we know that even though oftentimes we talk mostly about economic self-sufficiency, right? Everybody's always like, have we helped people become self-sufficient? Our lives are diverse, all of our lives. We touch on multiple things, even in our own day. So as this next slide shows, we know that as community partners and volunteers, these are all the different areas that we connect with, and also the areas that we measure whether or not a refugee is having a positive integration experience. There's civic engagement, stories about running for office, or access or lack of access to legal services. There's stories about employment, of course, and economic self-sufficiency. There's stories related to someone's education journey, or their physical or mental health experiences, or language access and proficiency. I love when any refugee tells a story that includes the multiple languages that they speak. And I mean multiple, right? We know that many refugees are bilingual, trilingual, multilingual. Stories about personal and community safety. So security experiences, either, again, community-based, feeling welcome, or even experiences with the police or others. Social belonging stories. I'm going to come back to that. And finally, transportation. When I work with someone who's a refugee that's trying to think about what stories, again, to help people narrow, or people who want to talk about refugees, I give them this whole list. And I'm like, do you have any interesting memories in any of these areas? And this is partly, again, how BR was able to build his library. And BR, I'm imagining that you must keep coming up with new stories in your mind all the time, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So I want to pause and see if there's any questions before I continue.
All right, let me see.
If not, I don't think I've seen it yet, but BR, while we see if anybody wants to include a question, how has storytelling been meaningful to you? What in some small ways has it changed your life, or big ways?
Well, one, when I came to the US, I wasn't able to stand up and speak in front of 10 people. And when you introduced me to storytelling and you start building confidence and building the strategies on how to tell stories, I remember when I graduated back in 2019, I was actually awarded as the commencement speaker, and I was able to speak in front of more than 1,500 people. That's one of the ways. Another way is the connection that it builds, having to actually listen to somebody's story and having to connect with them. So that is really, really important for me.
Yeah, and you were saying that, interestingly, you connected with people from different nationalities that you hadn't expected. Can you say a bit more
Yes.
about that?
Yes. Like when we tell stories, oftentimes than not, you think that people from certain countries have similar stories. But when you actually come to storytelling, it doesn't matter where you come from. You all tend to have a lot of commonalities than differences. And that is something that I learned through storytelling.
It's actually my favorite part whenever we do a public performance. Interestingly, the speakers don't meet each other before. They meet each other about an hour before the performance backstage. Everybody's like, I don't know, should I do this? There's a little anxiety which brings people together. But also, by the end of the evening, my favorite part is people are like becoming Facebook friends. They're being invited to dinner. I mean, you were saying you and Renaz were connecting. That for me is really the value of this too. In that last slide, if you noticed, I happen to have bolded the word social belonging. Some of the people asked, like, why do we promote these stories? Besides the fact that it's important and meaningful for the person, for me, it's about elevating social belonging and expanding people's social networks. That when we create platforms for someone like BR to stand up in front of 1,000 people, suddenly new opportunities have developed. We've had people go on and get job offers, be invited to be keynote speakers, be invited to write articles, co-lead workshops with refugees. So for me, it's like all of those other indicators, whether healthcare or public or employment or public safety, the more stories we tell that create a sense of social belonging, the more welcoming we create our communities. I also just love stories about social belonging. Trying again to model, like I could tell stories now about learning from BR and BR learning from me. I could tell a story about how BR was at my wedding. I would not have expected that 6 years ago. But because stories find connection and I'm learning and we're learning from each other and we're like, you know what, who doesn't love love? BR was able to come to our wedding. We had a great time. I don't know if you had a great time. I had a great time. It was my wedding.
I did.
Okay. But that's for me. I mean, it's so wonderful to see somebody's confidence. I don't remember if I told this story last time, but one of the most memorable moments also for me was a Syrian refugee. Cut me off, Brianna, if I told this story already. But she was backstage. She was also from Lowell, like BR. And when I met her in 2016, she did not speak very much English. She might have had like the basic, vocabulary. Most of our communication was through Google Chat, which we all know is problematic at times, but sometimes helpful. But remarkably, in 18 months, because of the education and ESL instruction she got at our resettlement agency, combined with working 2 jobs, including going to school where BR went to school at Middlesex Community College, she was able to tell her story on stage at the same show as BR for, again, 350 people. Now, she didn't have the full vocabulary that BR had, but when you focus on the nouns and the verbs and you can get the essence, she was amazing. Now, what nobody knows is that backstage, before she walked on stage, she turned to me and she's like, I don't know if I should do this. Now, I'm not going to make anybody walk on stage that does not want to. I was prepared to walk out. But luckily, the woman before her was a woman from the Dominican Republic who had come to this country speaking English, but with an accent. And she's on stage telling a story about how she struggled to find work, even though she had a master's degree, just because of her accent and some of her experiences with employers and the way that she worked to improve, to find a way to impact her community, but also work on the accent to work in New England. So she's telling this story. And all of a sudden, this woman, Zainab, turns to me and she's like, wait. Did she say she had to work on her English when she came to this country? And I said, yes, just like you. And she's like, oh, I can do this. And she walked on stage and she told an incredible story. Now, because of Zainab's exposure, she ended up being featured in the New York Times, in CNN as a Person of the Year after the election. She's had a documentary followed about her. And like BR, it's just that each time she was able to tell her story, the response from a community saying, help me learn more, which is really our goal with storytelling. It's to start conversations with people. Facts are important, but they don't start conversations, right? And so BR, you've had many conversations with many people since then. So those are some things to think about as you're crafting your story. It's kind of like mining for gold. Find the stuff that you think no one's heard from. And I'll say on a very practical level from a media perspective, one of the reasons I think our agency that I used to work for and what BR worked for had so much success with the media is when the journalists know that you're somebody who's going to be finding the story that no one's telling. Journalists love that. They want to know that there's a different story to be told. They want to be different. So cultivating and growing your story library is very important as well.
Yes, no, and I like your point of, like you were saying, like, oh, the woman going on stage and being nervous, it's kind of changing it from an anecdote to a story, right? We can all relate to some time when we felt nervous about something or thought maybe we couldn't do this, and then someone, like BR or Cheryl or what have you, does kind of make us think, oh no, wait, if someone else did this, I can do it too. I do want to just put a call out there. If anyone wants to submit any questions about anything during today's presentation, you can still go ahead and do that. Let's see. I also wanted to ask. There's a lot of people, that are joining us today that are staff or volunteers or sponsors. I guess one question I had was, so I hear what you're saying about developing the catalog of stories, right? And you've given us a few different ways to do that. But if I were a volunteer, a sponsor, or a staff member, or a refugee, is there like something that you would suggest? Maybe I'm not even going to be in a storytelling event, right? But what we're always telling stories at everywhere we go, right? Like, what should I do in this next week, maybe, to kind of like think about how and you can pull from things that you've said, right? But what would be your advice?
That's great. Yeah, and I mean, we are highlighting storytelling performances, but let's be honest, when you're going on the weekend to tell your friends about volunteering at a refugee agency, you're telling them stories. When you're in a job interview and you're a refugee coming to this country, you're telling stories. So it is the same principles in that environment as it is standing on stage like BR has done. So a couple quick things that I would do. I would get off this call, make a quick list of some universal themes, stories of courage, stories of love, stories of culture shock, and just write one sentence next to them, some experience that you will not forget, because I promise you they're there. We just honestly, we don't take the time to reflect on them. Maybe again, this question of like, take all the moments you've had and come back to like BR did. What is one day? What is one relationship you made? I have worked with over 1,000 storytellers, which is such a gift. Obviously, I remember as many as I can, but there are going to be a few. And I promise you, the few that I'm remembering more, perhaps, are people that connect to me on a meaningful level, like someone like BR that's become a friendship, or someone that challenged my own stereotypes. So quickly take those down. Now, there's a famous author named Matthew Dix who wrote the book Storyworthy. He actually has an exercise that at the end of every single day, he takes his Excel spreadsheet, he opens it as wide as his screen, that's as large as he allows himself, and he writes the story of the day. Now, sometimes he jokes about how that's just a conflict with his child trying to get them to eat peas, but also other days it's an unexpected encounter at CVS. Perhaps every day might be overwhelming for you, but what I do is every Friday on my computer, I write the story of the week that I'll never forget. Because as Matthew says, and all of us feel, once you start seeing the world through story, it actually, like, you see them everywhere. And it's a wonderful way to chronicle your life. It also gives you new material. If you're someone who's a development officer, marketing person at a nonprofit, or even a program individual, I also make sure that I have seasonal stories, because I might see a donor, I might see a foundation partner, I might see a volunteer a couple times a year. It's not going to be really exciting if I'm still telling them BR's story from 2 years ago. They want to know what's still keeping me motivated. So I make sure that I have that diversity. I also make sure that I have nationality diversity. One of my favorite moments, again, of a storyteller was this woman named TTIA. She was a Burmese refugee. When I gave her the list of story topics, she immediately resonated with transportation, which surprised me. I mean, she had a lot of stories to tell. She came to this country by herself. She spent a decade in a refugee camp. And I said, why is that? She goes, well, my first job was working for Southwick, which manufactures Brooks Brothers suits. But her case manager gave her an address, and she was working third shift in the middle of the night. And she, as a woman, had to take, she thought one bus, but it turned out to be 3 buses. She didn't speak English at the time, but all she had was the address. And she's just giving it to every bus driver, trusting that they're going to get her where she needs to be. And one of the stops was dropping her off what she described as a highway corner in like 2 a.m. in the morning. And she's like, well, I've lived through more scary situations, so I'm going to trust. And she ends up telling this whole beautiful story about trusting people, even though the person behind the wheel of the bus looks so different than her. She also talks about how excited she was when she finally bought a car, and being able to buy that car because of the job that she had.
No, I could see that. I could see that. We do have a question in here. First of all, someone was saying thank you for the powerful stories. And then someone had a question, likely for BR. Can you tell us about some of the different reception that you've had of your stories at different audiences? Particularly, they're also interested in the reception that you've received or people's reactions at the schools when you tell your story.
Actually, the reception has been really, really great. A lot of people give great feedbacks, and some people come to you and say, okay, I would like you to add these details some next time. So they actually kind of give you more things that they would like to hear. So the reception in general has been great. and a lot of great feedbacks.
He told a story at a high school outside of Boston that honestly didn't have as much diversity on the campus of the school. It was a high school, and we did ask for evaluations afterwards. And one young woman wrote, "I'm so glad that BR came and told us this story. So often we hear the stories through textbooks, we hear them told by other people, but to hear it in his own words, I'll never forget." So for me, it's like, yeah.
Yeah, that's a very good point. And yeah, and also thinking for those students, right, that having that opportunity of, you know, they're in those books and everything all the time, but yeah, having people with lived experience come and speak to them, I'm sure was meaningful as well. Let's see. So we're probably going to go ahead and wrap it up, but I do just want to thank both Cheryl and VR for joining us today. Oh, and actually, before we wrap up, Cheryl, will you tell us a little bit about this?
Sure. So one of the things that we do at Stellar Story Company, because we have such a diverse team, is we lead a workshop called Intercultural Storytelling. And it's digging into some of the themes we talked about today, like how do we find these stories? You actually leave with your own story library of whether you work in immigration or work with refugees, or frankly, in any multicultural community. We offer this in person, but we also offer it online. We also bring it into institutions. So there's different ways to engage. But if you were interested in jumping right in, our next session actually virtually is in January. It's a 6-hour course over 2 days. So you could sign up with us at our, there's a deal before the end of the year if you're interested. But it's a wonderful way to explore stories. And one of the interesting outcomes recently that I've been telling is there was a gentleman who contacted me after the first 3 hours. And he allows me to say this, he's a US born white man. And he said, "It seems like this whole training is about refugees." And I thought, because we had only shared one refugee story in the first 3 hours. We shared many different multicultural stories. But he started to realize that his lens is that anybody who is non-white was foreign. And then he assumed that many immigrants had had a similar refugee journey. So he and I talked about this. And so by the second session, he was like starting to realize that he needed to challenge his own ideas of who individuals are and his own stereotypes. He also said to me something interesting, which he's like, "I'm not sure I have a culture." And as a fellow Irish US born individual, I was like, "You do, but we just don't talk about it as much." And so by the end of the 6 hours, he had identified a meaningful intercultural moment for himself. So if you're interested in something like that, Stellar, this is some of our favorite work.
Great, thank you so much. Let's see, and also we'll head along to the next slide. Let's see, we want to hear from you and any feedback you can give us. If you'll go ahead and follow this QR code, we're also going to put a link in the chat to fill out this evaluation. And also we're going to be sending you an email with the link to this. It will also have a link to Stellar Stories and the opportunity that Cheryl mentioned. And I believe we're also going to link to some of BR's stories that he told in other venues. But that, I do want to ask folks to stay on and fill out the QR code. But thank you so much to Cheryl and BR. And also that email will also include a link to register for the next session in this series. The next lunch and learn in January, create a storytelling culture in your community. So with that, thank you all, and we hope you have an excellent rest of your day.
Thanks
so
everybody.
Much.
Thanks, BR.
Thank you.